So we're gonna get started. So awesome, just reading some of the chat. So normally what happens is we get lots of people watching the replays after. So hello to everyone watching the replay. At the end, we'll make sure to have time for Q&A with any of our guests that are here live. I think that's the beauty of coming to these live discussions. So let me get started just introducing our plan for today, and then I will let George and Ryan unleash their conversation for the day. Awesome. So I'm sure we can all see my screen. I hope so. Yep. All right. So welcome to this discussion brought to you by the the Maintenance Community Slack group. If you haven't already joined us, please do. Chelsea or Heather will add the join link in the chat. And if you're watching this replay, that link is still live and you can use it. We have over 700 maintenance and reliability professionals and counting in the group, just like George, and we host these conversations 1 to 2 times a week free to the community and then post all the replays there. Today we're going to be talking about maintenance in data centers with George. So thank you so much, George, for coming and joining us. One small piece of housekeeping. So at the bottom, there is a chat function. We'll be using that to hear questions from you throughout the conversation, and then we'll read them out later and go over them after. I guess with it being more of a discussion, we can interject throughout and ask different questions that we're hearing from the community. It's a little more live than usually with webinars. So without further ado, I'd love to give Ryan and George a chance to introduce themselves and kind of talk about what inspired this conversation.
George, you want to go first?
Yeah, let's do it. So, hey everybody, George Parada. I'm with Facebook, and my role is Global Asset Management Manager. It's actually a lot longer, but I'm just going to keep it short. And my specific role focuses on managing and leading our teams that manage our programs and processes around preventative maintenance, lifecycle management, and our spare parts optimization as we're looking at keeping these data centers up and running. So all of you that are using Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook can always log in and make sure that you guys can always see and stay connected to the people, friends and family that you love. So it's a little bit about me.
All right, thanks for sharing, George. A little bit about myself. I'm Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Upkeep. My journey in the maintenance and reliability side actually came on the process side. Worked in a manufacturing plant, chemical engineer. This is me working in the manufacturing plant. Saw how bad technology was. Said I want to build something better, and that was kind of the start of Upkeep. But George, we've got a history to go back on too. I think to answer that question around like what inspired this conversation, I think I'd been following you. We were connected on LinkedIn probably like what 3+ years ago.
Probably longer.
Probably longer. Yeah. And then obviously you're over at Constellation. Constellation was one of our customers, and more recently you made the move over to Facebook and done some amazing things that we had the amazing privilege to watch you do over at Constellation, now over at Facebook. So obviously wanted to pick your brain for the community around what you've learned, the good, the bad, the ugly, the great. So that's kind of what inspired today's discussion. Before we jump in, actually, we've got a few attendees here, and I'm going to call you out. So I would love if you guys could type into the chat, like, what's your title, and maybe a burning question you've got for, George over at Facebook. Type it over into the chat. We'll try to get to it. And with all that, George, you ready for this?
Yeah, I will say for those that are typing in those questions, if you've been locked out of your account, I won't be able to help you with any of that.
Oh man, yeah, you don't do that, George? I'm just kidding.
Only for close family and friends.
All right, so George, obviously you've got a long history. You've done a ton of amazing things at the global level for maintenance and reliability at Facebook. What was your journey into maintenance and reliability?
Yeah, so similar to you, Ryan, I actually worked in like that plant environment as well, right out of college, where I was responsible for a production area for a global food and beverage organization. And similar to like yourself, I was in operations, and I was just really fed up with how things were running on like in my department. And there was a big opportunities to see how could we get like our equipment to be more reliable, because we keep breaking down. I'm missing customer orders. I didn't come up with the idea of like, hey, we need to come up with like this cool app like Upkeep. It was more of like, well, what could I do to like start to like make a difference here to make sure that we can not only meet our customer requirements, but to make sure that we can be reliable and safe operations. And so I sat down with my manager, and he said, hey George, like, well, you're doing all this talk. Why don't you go run maintenance? I'm like, all right, I've never done it before. Let's go check it out. And so, my background was mechanical engineering, so I had a passion just to understand how things work, anyways. And so I ran the maintenance department, and very quickly, a lot of improvements that we made. A lot of it was just really getting the skill sets of our folks to the level that they needed to be. A lot of them had a passion to learn into new areas like predictive and condition-based type of inspection. So, we got into that whole space of around oil analysis and vibration, and just really starting to understand like how we can continue to evolve that. And so eventually, I got to like run maintenance for that whole entire plant. And then fast forward a couple of years later, I got the opportunity to lead the maintenance reliability team for the organization. So I was responsible for about like 22 locations across the world, and that was a lot of fun because we got to see a lot of the opportunities that we had, best practices that certain sites were doing that we needed to like leverage for the entire organization. And so I did that for about 13 years at that company, and a lot of fun. A lot of traveling, got to see a lot of different operations, because there was not just like the operation that I was in, but also got to see other plants, other type of opportunities that we had. And so that's what took me over to Constellation, which you mentioned earlier, Ryan. And there I got to really kind of just jumpstart and kind of from like a clean slate, just to understand like what opportunities do we have to really kind of set just some foundational maintenance practices. We were at that point where we were, our work order system was a whiteboard. It was Excel spreadsheets. And I said, no, look, like there's a better way to do this. And they had tried a couple of different things. We said, okay, well, let's like just try to get something scaled out for the organization here. And so that was like when we actually came across Upkeep and many other systems too. We went through a whole vetting process, and to give Upkeep the shout out here, and Ryan team, like that it's the one that really shook out in the end for that organization. And we started kind of ramping up and implementing it across many of the wineries and operations that we had there at Constellation. And so here there's definitely a lot of great things that are still happening there, but a lot of there was just like really understand like what's going to be foundational. What are like these processes that we really needed to like improve, and what we needed to like really focus on. And similar to like like at my first employer, which if I didn't mention before, it was Cargill. I learned there a lot about like the people processes, the work management processes that are essential, and then also making sure that you understand that you always have to be improving your maintenance strategies for your maintenance program. Not just on the PMs and the other type of maintenance tasks, but then also around like spare parts. But most importantly, like the people, like how are you like enabling the people so they can execute those things effectively? Long story short, was at the Constellation gig for about 18 months and found myself over at Facebook, where initially didn't come into the role that I was in. I was specifically brought in to help focus on a spare parts optimization program that we had going on here. We didn't have an asset management team like when I first came in. It was actually like part of my manager at the time. It was part of his role to really get that going. And as we started to like uncover a lot of other opportunities, similar to like my past experiences and learnings, it's like, well, man, like well, we need to be focusing on these areas. From an asset management perspective, we need to start thinking about like how this all ties into how we utilize our work order system that we use. And it really spun off to like, hey, well, like we're going to have this asset management team that we're going to put together, and got the chance to be, to lead that team, and, grew the team a little bit. There's a lot of work to do. I would say, from maturity level, there's a lot of work that we have ahead of us. But, I think, as Facebook continues to scale, there's a lot of opportunities that we're focusing on to really not only keep, our customer happy, but then also making sure that we have some very sustainable processes in place so we can be reliable, we can be safe. I mean, at the end of the day, like, our mission at Facebook is to give the people the power to build community and just really bring the world closer together. And, our data centers are a big piece of that. So, I'll kind of pause there, but for me, like, it was a big shift. I will say, coming from food and beverage, after like 15 or so years, and coming to data centers, never did I think that I was going to be here where I am today. But having a lot of fun, being able to really translate a lot of the things that other industries and even like oil and gas and nuclear and chemical companies do. It's not very different. So
that's awesome. George, thank you so much for, again, taking the time. And to all of our attendees that recently joined, please type in some questions, give us some great questions. We already have a few, and I think that there's some really good ones in here. So I'm gonna read one from let's see. I think David asked this question. Very curious about maintaining cooling systems and what redundancy is important over at Facebook. Obviously, data centers, cooling systems are incredibly important. Any thoughts around that, George?
Yeah, I would say probably like some of our most critical assets. I mean, typically data centers are very heavy, like electrical asset based, where, I mean, the cooling is what's really keeping the racks and servers, to the optimal, temperature, and make sure that those things are running reliably and safe. But I guess, like, from the standpoint of just making sure that, at the end of the day, like, what is the goal that you're really just trying to accomplish? And, like, what is the amount of like data halls that you're also like looking at cooling? So, like, for me, like, when I think about for cooling systems and for redundancy, I guess it really just I guess it really depends on the application, because for us, like, we have a certain amount of redundancy. Like, I can't say exactly like what that is, but when I think about the level of redundancy that we need to have, we just need to make sure that we're focusing on like the right maintenance strategy on those specific assets. So one of the things that we've really been focusing on recently is actually going through an asset criticality process and understanding, like, hey, so like, if we have this level of redundancy, what kind of maintenance are we going to do? Obviously, in critical cooling, you're not going to run that thing to fail, but we're going to introduce, like, let's say, certain elements of a condition-based maintenance. So that's something like a new space for us, as we're partnering with some of these vendors on the outside to understand, like, what type of technology we can introduce, like with IoT. How can we start to like understand even like on the on our filtration systems, like, where do we have opportunities there? So that's probably not like the answer that you're looking for, is what the level of redundancy, but it's more about like what's the right maintenance that you want to be doing to make sure that you're not impacting your operation, you're not taking down a server or even a data hall.
Yeah, no, that's great. I really appreciate that. And something that I was wondering, George, obviously I knew you from Constellation Brands, and then you made the switch over to maintaining reliability at Facebook data centers. Are there big differences between running maintenance reliability at a food beverage manufacturer relative to, one of the largest tech companies in the world?
I thought that there was when I was on the outside, and again, I never really thought that I was going to be working, at a company like Facebook, because I'm like, okay, well, isn't those typically like just guys that are like software engineers and they're coding and doing all of that? But at the end of the day, if you really think about it, like, you're managing assets, and whether you're managing assets for data centers or for like a bottling plant or a chemical plant, like, you're managing assets. And so you might be managing different type of assets, but like all like the processes, like they should all still be the same. You know, you're gonna like look at understand like, okay, what are like what's my master asset record list? Which ones of those are critical? Which ones of those are the ones that I need to be doing maintenance on versus the ones that I'm going to be running to failure? Where should I be investing more resource heavy time of my craft? Where should I not? Because you know, I might have, like, again, back to that last question, that level of redundancy where if I were to lose like one of these chillers or one of these assets, it's not going to really impact my operation. And so I think at the end of the day, I don't really see much difference. I mean, I think some of the maturity level of like data center organizations are probably not at the level like where companies like, you know, oil and gas, chemical plants, and those guys, they've been doing this for decades, right? They've been doing, you know, RCM, and they've been doing just like world-class, you know, precision type of maintenance. And so I think that's the opportunity within data centers is like, how do we just not see ourselves that we're just like this completely different type of industry, even though that we are, but when it comes to managing assets, like we should be looking at it from the same approach.
That's actually really interesting because I kind of came at it from like a, you know, wildly different industry, must be very, very different. But what I hear from you is like the strategy is very similar, whether you're oil and gas plant, whether you're, you know, managing data centers.
I will say, Ryan, sorry to interrupt, but I will say that the level of redundancy, at least from my experience here, is like no other that I've ever seen before. And what I mean by that is that, you know, because of like the critical operation that we have, that these data centers, you know, we cannot drain a region, we cannot shut down one of these operations. You know, we have to have that level of redundancy, and so we have to spend like the capital dollars, and we have to incorporate that into the design. Where like in other, you know, like where I came from like food plants, you know, we were lucky if we had maybe a couple of extra pumps there that were running, and you know, we had to, you know, do whatever it took, you know. And just like I'm sure like in other industries like oil and gas and chemical plants and others, you know, you're gonna have a certain level of redundancy, but at the end of the day, like you always have to make sure that how are you like looking back at like your design for reliability and understanding like, okay, like, do I really need this much level of redundancy, or could I just maybe identify this through like a maintenance task, you know, or maybe even technology like condition-based maintenance and like IoT sensors that are out there. So just wanted to make a point about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, you know, obviously if, you know, a data center goes out, the entire world and, you know, a quarter of the internet, it goes out with it. So, you know, we talk
you hear about it. I mean,
it makes
hey,
headlines.
Instagram was down for 10 minutes yesterday. People are going to hear about that.
Yeah. We got another question, just like, you know, what are common assets that you find within a data center? And I'm also curious, another question that came out of this from Tim was, you know, at what point did Facebook realize they had assets that needed to be maintained, and that they realized like, hey, actually we need a reliability leader, someone like yourself, George?
Yeah, so the first question, like the type of assets. So, I mean, a lot of these large data centers, you know, and, you know, Google, you know, Amazon and Google and these companies all, you know, kind of like the same type of infrastructure is like, I mean, you're going to have like your switch yard, right? So that's going to, all your incoming electrical, that's going to feed into your data center. And then so it's going to be from there, it's going to be your transformers, it's going to be your switchboards, you know, all that electrical gear that's going to essentially energize like these data halls. But then you have like all your cooling, which, you know, we were talking about earlier, that you have your critical cooling system. These are going to be like large HVAC systems. In some cases, you're going to have chillers and like your whole plant that's really focusing on just the heating and cooling. There's going to be the industrial water, you know, your fire and life safety type of systems. So, I mean, a lot of these are assets that we've all heard of or we've all seen, like if you've never worked in data centers. You know, like if I talk about like a pump or a tank or or like an automatic transfer switch, you know, like these are the kind of things that like we have like in many industries. So that's when I was talking about earlier, like there's not that much difference. When we get to like the racks and servers and what's in the data halls, yeah, that stuff's a little bit different, because the thing that I always talk about is I mean, in my old plant, my like server room was like a closet. Here it's like it's closet times like a million, because you got these huge data halls that, I mean, that's what we're trying to energize there. We're like over here, I mean, this was just to kind of keep our control systems going, and our all of our data analysis type of systems, right? So I guess to answer the second question, Facebook's been around for 16 years, and it's probably been about like 10 years of that, these data centers have been operational because of the scale, right? I mean, when we think about even just like I got here about a little over a year ago, and even since then, we've gone from like 35 to almost like 50,000 employees, and even like 4 years ago, like it was about like 4 to 5 data centers like across the world. We just announced break ground on 2 more. You guys might have heard about this on LinkedIn, or 2 additional data centers that are going to come online, or I'm sorry, break ground here in the next year. So now we're talking about like 20 plus data centers globally, with one that's also like in construction in Singapore. So also getting that like APAC footprint. And so it was probably like in that like 4 to 5 year range. It said, you know what, like we need to like we need to start having like our maintenance programs and practices around this, right? This was obviously before my time. And so we need to make sure that we understand how are we going to like not just do like what the OEMs are telling us. How are we going to make sure that we have like, hey, this is like our operation, how are we going to own this? Because typically you get your manuals with your assets and your equipment, but that's not tailored to like your specific operation. Like what is like our requirement, like as Facebook or as Google or Amazon, whatever data center that you're talking about. And and just started to kind of build out like what that library was. Again, this was still part of somebody's role. And it wasn't until like within the last year that, we need to have like this whole team that's nothing but what they're dedicated to is asset management, just really scaling up these preventative maintenance programs. Now we're even talking about how we just look at the aging of these data centers. I mean, these data centers, in some cases, they're not that old. Like I worked in plants that were like 80, 100 years old, and we're talking about an operation that's maybe 5, 10 years old, and you're like, well, holy crap! Like these things are, these things, you could eat eggs off of the floor. They're super clean, and these assets are brand new. But I mean, the technology in data centers is something that just is ever evolving, and so making sure that you have like those maintenance schedules set up, and I mean, there's just a lot that as we were starting to scale, so we needed to have like those teams and those roles in place. So I mean, I'm pretty happy that I got the chance to be like the first asset management manager for our data center team here. There's plenty more for us to do. Like I said, we're just getting started on some of these foundational programs.
That's awesome. I mean, what I hear, George, and correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, but what I heard is like, the types of equipment that you manage, not that different than what probably all of us have seen at our own plants. But I think what I did hear that was different is when you rank like the criticality, when you think about like the effect of failure. Obviously a server room at Facebook is going to be way higher on the criticality list than, at a let's call it separate plant. And you create redundancies based off of criticality. And because the criticality is different at each company, we operate in a slightly different way.
100%. Yeah. And that's why like, and even like when you get these like OEM recommendations, like on these assets, right? They're going to make a determination like why it needs to be maintained that way. But like, it's all about the operational context. Like, how are you going to use this asset is then when you need to like understand like, hey, what are all the failure modes that we experience, and some of that needs to be data driven, like that's something that like we've started to like look at too, is like, what are the failure modes that we are experiencing that are coming out of our CMMS? And how do we need to just start to like, most companies call, or organizations refer to it like PM optimization. How are you optimizing like those inspections, those failure finding tasks to understand like how are you going to right size the maintenance? Because at the end of the day, like we could be doing a lot of things that might be introducing defects that could be causing more harm than good. And so I think that's really important to, hey, take the OEM input, for that asset in that operating context. But like you said, if I'm now working in at a Chevron facility or, something along those lines, it's a completely different operating context, and there's probably like other environmental considerations I have to like now take into place. Maybe there's more chemicals that are impacting in data centers. Not really a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got some awesome questions coming in. Keep them coming in. We've got a question from Shadrach here. How do you develop talent within your organization? And, obviously you mentioned the team's growing. How have you helped develop talent?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, I mean, our team is very small right now, which makes it, makes it even easier, right, to make sure that we're making that a focus. And we were actually having this discussion earlier today, like within our team around, like, how are we like making sure that we have like those individual development plans like set up for each one of our team members. But not only that, like, how are we also focusing on like what does the team need? Like, what is the team? Where is like the team falling short on that we need to make sure that we're developing some skills? And so, not to give a shout out to like my friends over at Reliability Web, but one of the things is I said, you know what, like we have some brand new people on the team that maybe don't have a lot of asset management experience, but they're helping stand up some of these programs. So we actually just signed up for this 12-week CRL training for all of our team, just to take them through that, right? And we want to make sure that not only do we have the skills and the learnings that we have like from Facebook, but we got to take the blinders off and say like, all right, like what is like the best in class organizations doing, and how can we learn from them and like add that to like our tool belts. So for me, it's like, think about your team, but then like what is like then the individual they need to focus. So then I need to then understand like how is like my individual team member like mastering their role. Where do we have gaps where I need to like coach and mentor them as their manager and working with them. But the last thing I will say about that is the manager needs to be supported, but at the end of the day, it's about that employee owning that. So that employee needs to own their own development and making sure that, hey, if the manager's going to break those barriers down for you, get those opportunities in front for you, you have to be the one driving it, and you have to be the one bringing, the effort to the table as the person being developed. So,
absolutely, and you're right. Big shout out to the team over at Reliability Web. They do great things for this industry and the community. I was actually just talking to Maura earlier today, actually.
Awesome.
We've got another question. Maybe this will be the last question. I know it's already 6 o'clock right now. Came from Jerry. What's your most recent best lesson that you've learned that you could share with all of us?
Most recent best lesson. Yeah, what I will say is I think sometimes we, this is something I learned here, so I think it's pretty relevant. So I appreciate the question. I think sometimes, like reliability is a journey, right? When you think about like when you're trying to implement like an asset management or reliability program, you're really just trying to like, just take the organization to the next level. And sometimes we spend a lot of time just trying to perfect it before we roll it out. And sometimes, we need to be okay with continuous improvement. Say, what, like I'm going to deliver like this 90%, maybe 80% solution. And because the organization or the team needs it now. And, we're going to implement it, we're going to train and we're going to have a learning event. And then we're going to just evolve it as we go, because sometimes, like these things, they take years sometimes. But if I want to make sure I have it well thought out, again, that it becomes 80-90% solution. So let's say, like, for example, like asset criticality. And then I'm going to have to evolve it over time. I'm going to go pilot it. I'm going to go implement it. And then I'm going to have like that first session. I'm like, what, like we needed to maybe tweak it this way. So I'm going to go tweak it that way. And then I'm going to revise and I'm going to continuously improve like that program. And so I guess bottom line is sometimes, we get kind of stuck into the minutia, making sure that it's 100% perfect. And you're not going to get it right. And I'm sure like upkeep, it's probably not the same what it was, a couple of years ago. And if you tried to perfect it, you probably would have never released what it's become now. I mean, so you have to like really make sure that you're always thinking about continuous improvement, get to the market or get to your organization or your team like what you can, and just evolve it.
Yeah, I mean that's such a great sentiment I think to end with here, which is this idea of like perfection. Actually, one of our core values is this idea around progress over perfection, and I think it's actually funny in the reliability world. I think reliability does have this sense baked into the word of we want to be 100% reliable and stay up 100%, but I think what you mentioned here is that it's a journey.
Yeah, and I'll just say one last thing there, Ryan. And one of our values is to move fast. And we
and break things
and break things. No, but in data centers, it's not, it's move fast, but do things safely, because we don't want to break things in reliability.
Exactly.
But yeah, we do need to move fast, but so at the same time, again, it becomes that whole culture of evolving, and you don't want like perfection to block you and not allow you to make that impact and take things where they need to go.
Absolutely. You got some you hit the dart on the target emojis here in the chat. You've got a hashtag continuous improvement. So yeah, I think a lot of people are resonating here. I know that we're up on time. Really appreciate everyone for joining today. Caitlin, any final words over here?
Just some logistics. So we will post this replay in the Slack community under webinar replay. George, we had even more questions. So whenever you get around, I'll add the questions in there and you can just Slack your responses. But people loved hearing from you, so we really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining.
Awesome, man. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the Upkeep team for having me.
Of course. Have a great rest of everyone's evening here. Really
Thanks.
appreciate it, George. Thanks.
Thanks.